Well, good afternoon once again, everyone. I think as Judge Hill just reminded us, these are issues that keep the National Security Council awake at night as much as the President. And before we begin our first panel, I wanted to just frame the conversation around resilience, that it's not just a function of solving the very biggest challenges we face. In 2003, a tree branch in Ohio touched a power line that sent the entire East Coast and 11 million residents into darkness for several days. And so something that simple can also trigger a cascade of failures, and it's something we need to consider, that it's not just a function of solving the biggest challenges we have, but it's also a function of solving the very simple ones. So with that, I have the privilege of moderating this first panel. To my left, we have Meghan Doherty, who is with the Urban Adaptation Assessment with NDGain. She'll provide a totally different lens, I think, to the issue of city resilience and bringing it down to a granular human level. I've been the beneficiary of Tommy Wells and his political leadership in the city as a member of Ward 6. He now is the head of the Department of Energy and Environment for Washington, D.C., and I think brings a critical voice to this subject from the city's perspective. Further down the panel, we have David Flandro, who's the global head of analytics for JLT, brings the private sector perspective. JLT is a leader in the global insurance and risk management market and really sees how all of this stuff manifests in the private sector. I'm very eager to hear what David has to add. And then last but not least, our tireless colleague, Andrew Holland, with the American Security Project, will lend that perspective as well. So Meghan, being the fairest of the participants on the panel, we'll turn to you for some opening remarks, and then there will be Q&A in this session. I know the audience probably has a lot to add as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to be here today and talk to you all about this very important issue of risk and resiliency in cities, but also this very large issue. So I know that many of us in the room today and on the panel probably all have a unique perspective. Different things come to mind when we think of city risk and resilience. In addition, we've maybe even carved out our own area of expertise. And so I'm here on behalf of NDGain, the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, which is all about spreading awareness to the world of the need to adapt to the changing climate. And so about a year ago, we started work on the Urban Adaptation Assessment, which is a tool to inform decision makers about the vulnerability of their cities in light of the changing climate and help prioritize adaptation action and direct investment to where it's most needed. And so carving out that piece of the larger risk puzzle, today I have three main things I want to touch on in our talks. The first being why urban. And so thinking about this focus on the urban level, we know that it's where there's a lot at stake. Half the world's population already living in urban areas, that number projected to increase. But also the economic risk is huge. I mean, Lloyd's City Risk Index, those numbers are staggering of what is at stake here. But not only is there a risk on the urban level, there's also quite an opportunity. A lot of the risks that we'll be talking about today, and climate change included, not only manifest in local problems, but really call for localized solutions. So to my next point, why adaptation? Well, as Judge Hill just said, we know that climate change is happening. It's here. Its impacts are here. Even with the most aggressive mitigation on the global level, we're already seeing those impacts, feeling those impacts. So more and more of those puzzle pieces are going in the climate change category in terms of urban risk. And with the Paris Agreement coming out of COP21, a remarkable turning point in terms of global reaction to climate change, we had 195 countries come together and not only sign goals regarding greenhouse gas emission reduction standards, but also specifically call out the need for adaptation to set standards and objectives around climate change adaptation. So thinking of just recent events, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, the drought in California, which in 2014 alone was projected to cause $2.2 billion in economic damages. There's a need for adaptation right now in our urban areas. So with that, to my third point, how do we start? What are we telling our cities to do? And so there are going to be a lot of assessment tools out there, different indices, all trying to talk to a different stakeholder and have a different objective. And for us, thinking about each city as a circle. So bear with my visual here, right? We've got cities as a circle, and all of these risks are external forces pushing down on our cities. In terms of climate change, we're focusing on 4 main hazards. So looking at flooding, drought, extreme heat, and extreme cold. And seeing how those hazards push down on our cities and measuring them not only in terms of their future projected magnitude, so how bad are these hazards going to be, not only in terms of their likelihood, the probability of them, but also what is the projection for this future hazard compared to that city's historical baseline? What does the city know as normal in terms of flooding, and what is it going to become? Because sometimes that change is really what can make all the difference for a city. So coming back to our visual, seeing those external forces culminating in some level of vulnerability for a city. So how sensitive are you to that future flooding hazard? What percentage of your housing is in the floodplain? But then also, how ready are you? These can be things about a city that have nothing to do with climate, but could help it adapt. What sort of social programs do you have in place for your most vulnerable population? Those can make the difference. And then coming in even more to the center, the heart of our assessment framework, and I believe the heart of this issue in general, working towards lives saved and livelihoods improved. So thinking of climate change adaptation and with other assessment and measurement tools, these other risks, all in terms of saving lives and improving livelihoods in our world cities, lending to more resilient cities and a more resilient world. So, thank you.
Thank you, Megan. So Tommy Wells has pioneered, I think, one of the more innovative responses to some of these challenges here in DC, and it's something he imported from the United Kingdom, the infamous Boris bikes that you see all over the UK. So Tommy, something like that is such an incredibly powerful market response that changes the way people communicate and convey, transport themselves in a city. But from your lens, Tommy, what would you have as opening remarks?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you on a personal level what you and your wife Amal have shown in terms of leadership of what makes strong, resilient neighborhoods with your leadership at a very local level as well. So thank you very much for what you guys do. So my job as the Director of Energy and Environment for Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, also home, as you know, to about 670,000 people now. And looking at what is it about our city that we have to look at of what's facing us. And we had a great presentation from Judge Hill. She laid out very well what the challenges are, and what it means for D.C. is that we're a city that will always be under the threat of terrorism, but now that we have to measure what our response is to climate change, that's another threat and challenge for your nation's capital. And so we are on 2 rivers, as we all know, that they're 2 tidal rivers. They're not dammed or tamed in any way, so we're very much subject to the rise and fall of the oceans and any type of storm event that pushes our rivers up into the city. So one of our greatest threats will be flooding. During Hurricane Isabel, we had the waters pushed up. The Anacostia River came up by an extra 8 feet. And at Blue Plains, the largest sewage treatment plant in the modern world, is that the water level almost got within 4 feet of coming over the wall and swamping Blue Plains, which then the city would have had to have been evacuated. So I promise you that wall is much higher now, but we're in much better shape. So the extreme weather of that being a city that's affected by coastal waters is the first. Second is that we have to look at what's happened and what can happen with rivers, that when there's major snowfall up in the mountains and a lot of rain, then our rivers can flood coming this way towards the water, just like almost any other community that's where you're located on rivers. I remember looking at a bridge from around 1903 or so of Chain Bridge that the water got up so high it brought Chain Bridge off the moorings and swept it away. For any of those that know Chain Bridge, that is a very high level of water. So we have that issue as well. But then the other issue that we have found in the city that the judge talked about, that she described as I guess rain bombs, which are microbursts, that in DC, usually FEMA and the other folks that look at the city, they look at where you border water. they haven't really done a lot of modeling around these rain bombs. And so we have an area called Bloomingdale that has had a number of rain bombs that have flooded quite dramatically that we've had to deal with that we did not have in the past, and that's in the city. The Federal Triangle, which includes the archives. Some of you may have seen that flooded during one of those rain bombs, and in their auditorium, much larger area than this, but in that building, it was up around your waist, the level of the water in the National Archives. So the buildings that house some of the most precious documents and functions for the country are subject to things like rain bombs, where it used to be that we were concerned about water coming up from the channel and flooding the city. This happened from inside the city and flooded those areas, and we have to look out and figure out how to manage that. Many of you may have noticed that if you take 17th Street up from Rock Creek Parkway, over by the White House, there's now a levee that's gone in that we can put in panels as soon as we see water's coming up. But again, that's coming up from the channel in the Potomac. It's not coming from inside the city. So we have to deal with that. The other threat to Washington, D.C. is what Meghan talked about, is extreme weather. That May was the hottest month in the history of Washington, D.C., and we are working on a climate adaptation plan to try to match what we now know about what the threats are to D.C. and what we believe are the threats going forward, but match it to our infrastructure. At what point do the rails of Metro start to warp? At what point do they crack under cold? And we have longer periods of extreme heat, which also, as we've always known, is a toxic mix for ozone and other things that directly impact our health, but it really taxes our infrastructure. And we're trying to create a model that shows from bridges to other areas of the city, what do we have to do to try to protect the infrastructure? So these are things that are predicted and projected. It's hard often to get a populace excited about something that hasn't happened. And so we've certainly seen with Katrina and with Hurricane Sandy and other events where cities adapt and begin to create structure. But all across the world this is true. It wasn't until Copenhagen had a flood, a 500-year flood that they never imagined, that Copenhagen began to retool that city. And unfortunately, that seems to be the impetus for retooling cities. Now in D.C., beyond Isabel, we had something called a derecho. I don't know if anybody had heard of a derecho before we had a derecho, but it had everything to do with the amount of energy that was in the air after evaporating a lot of water, and then it exploded in the city, took out hundreds of trees, knocked out power in some parts of the city for up to 2 weeks. It was an explosion that, if you were here, there was no weather forecaster saying we're about to have a major storm event. It exploded. And so those are the kind of things that we have to adapt to, that we have to change, and I can go more into it through question and answer around green roofs, stormwater management, all the different things that we're trying to do to adapt the city. But D.C., like other cities around the world, is very subject to the changes brought about by climate change.
Thank you, Tommy. And if I might add, one of the other rare events that we had in that time was an earthquake, something that might not have been in our climate or meteorological sample on the East Coast.
That's right.
So, David, so much of the things that Tommy described are now making their way into the private sector. What are you seeing in JLT?
Well, I guess, I got to turn this on. Okay. I guess I'm kind of the odd man out up here because I'm from the private sector, and everybody's also better looking and slimmer than me, except for you, except for maybe Tommy. But anyway, we in the private, I work for JLT. JLT is a brokerage and risk advisory firm. We see everything, and we have seen everything for many, many years, and so has Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London obviously has been insuring risk. They can tell me, probably Sean knows the exact year when they were founded, but it was a long time ago in a coffee shop in London. Really, though, we honestly, if you think about it, if you think about all the different risks that are out there, we've got climate risk, or what we would call meteorological or atmospheric risk, seismic risk, there's terrorism risk, there's cyber risk, and then there's general liability risk, in addition to all the other specialty risks like aviation and everything that's out there. And we look at it all, we study it all, and we see the after effects of it all. So Piedra Loma, Northridge, Typhoon Muriel, Hurricane Andrew, September 11th, July 7th, Hurricanes Charlie, Ivan, Jean, Katrina, Rita, Wilma, Ike, Gustav. These are all things that we've insured, reinsured, and then helped victims of disasters collect claims on. Judge Hill talked about Canterbury and Christchurch and what happened there, Cyclone Yazi, Tohoku Fukushima, for heaven's sake, San Bernardino, Paris. The risks in the world are increasing because of things like climatological risk, seismic risk, terror risk. As Meghan mentioned and alluded to, we've got more people living in more places than we ever have. That's actually the number one driver of economic and insured losses. Number one is increased population distribution and increased loss penetration on the coasts. So why am I mentioning all this? I don't want to frighten everybody, but there is a lot of risk in the world right now just by nature of the fact that our population has grown so much and our cities have gotten a lot bigger. Think about Florida in the 1970s. Anybody was in Florida in the 1970s? I wasn't. I was in San Francisco. I'm a native San Franciscan, so I was disappointed to hear Judge Hill say that San Francisco's growing or slower economic growth than LA. But Florida is a completely different place than it was in the 1970s, and so looking at historical experience data is actually almost impertinent now. And that's why in the private sector we look at two things. We look at exposure data, which is based on forward stochastic modeling, and it's based on the kind of analysis that Lloyd's have done, and it's based on historical experience data where we have data that we think are good enough. But a lot of times, especially in developing markets, especially in places like Thailand where we've got exposures that we didn't even know about, we look at exposure data. Now, I just want to say something because I know this is I know we're in Washington and we're talking about ways that we in the public sector can help mitigate some of these issues. And I would just posit to you one thing. I know the insurance sector is not always the most popular sector to talk about, but surprise, I'm going to plug for it here. Without the insurance sector, risk premia in our world would be much higher. Without the ability for governments, for companies, and for people to transfer and pool risk premia would be much higher. You may not know this, but insurance companies over the cycle, they barely break even on underwriting. They make almost all their money on the premiums that they take from you and invest in the meantime. You can look at the industry data and see this. One of the great ironies in our sector right now is that we have too much capital. We are overcapitalized. And even though we've got all these risks, believe it or not, prices have come down. In reinsurance particularly, in specialty reinsurance, property catastrophe reinsurance, even in some primary insurance lines, prices have come down. There is a loss gap in terms of what is covered by insurers and the economic risk out there. And that entire loss gap simply cannot be met by the federal government. It's just too big, given all the things that we're talking about. So I'm here to tell you that it's tools like the Lloyd's City Risk Index, which look at exposure data for cities that we didn't have before, that government should be using in order to basically figure out where the risks are. And there are a lot of them. I'm going to flatter my colleagues here from Lloyd's, even as a proud American. Lloyd's of London is the most advanced specialty risk market in the world. And I say that as an American who's lived in London for a long time. I'm trying to flatter Sean here because he and I have had some policy disagreements in the past. But it's true. This is the best data in the world on city risk exposure, except for maybe the kind of stuff that Tommy puts together for his city independently. But this is what we need. We need exposure data for cities so we can see where are the risks that we don't even know about yet. And think about Bangkok. Think about Thailand in 2011. In Thailand, we had a huge amount of commercial losses and floods that we had no idea that we had that kind of exposure. There are cities like that in the United States too, where we've got exposures that we don't even know about yet because population has changed, demographics have changed, all the things that we're talking about in relation to climate change, in relation to seismic risk. Think about Norfolk, Virginia. I don't want to pick on Norfolk if anybody's from there, from around here, but Norfolk, Virginia is below sea level, isn't it? And it's, if they have a big hurricane, the communications in and out of Norfolk are not great. You know, we could have more freeways going in and out of Norfolk to help people. These are the kinds of things that the Lloyd City Risk Index can uncover. It's exposure data, it's the most advanced data, and if I'm going to make a pitch anywhere, it's that we need more data, we need more information so that we can underwrite these risks. And I think that this is an area where a lot of municipalities could transfer risk to the insurance sector, which has too much capital right now, and where rates are lower than they've been since the late 1990s. I'll just say one final thing. One of the great opportunities that I had in my former life, and I'm looking at one of my former colleagues over there, I see you in the corner, was after Superstorm Sandy, I got to work with the mayor's office, and you know, I'm not a Democrat, but it was touching how concerned they really were for the well-being of the people in that city, the little guys that were living down closer to the coast, that were getting flooded, and they were trying to understand how can we use the insurance market and the reinsurance market to help pay these people back next time this happens. Because these big infrastructure projects can take 10 or 20 years. Guess what? All those things that I mentioned, you know, Charlie, Ivan, Jean, Katrina, Rita, Wilma, Gustav, Ike, Tahuku, the Thai floods, I can rattle them off for you. They're happening every year, and they're hurting people every year. So I'm here to tell you, you should use the best data in the sector from Lloyd's to enable the insurance sector to come in with some of our capital and help you, help your constituencies, help the public while we build out the infrastructure in this country.
Thank you, David. It's such a grim message delivered so cheerfully. Really appreciate that. But genuinely, from a public policy angle, I think the point you make is accurate, which is that each time FEMA steps in and we're building a New Orleans on the government dole, effectively that's coming out of taxpayer pockets, and it's mostly an unfunded loss. And I think what David just argued for is to put the private sector in that place first, and use the federal government and the other state backstops as the last line of defense as opposed to the first line of defense.
We're pretty cheap. We're pretty cheap right now.
Yeah. So taking kind of a public policy angle, Andrew Holland, what opening remarks do you have?
Thanks, Dante. And you know, I think my role here is to. I liked how David and Tommy got into kind of the nitty-gritty of this. So I think what I'm going to do is kind of bring it up a level to kind of national security issues and why risk and all of this, as I said, as Judge Hill said, is a national security issue. So I think resilience is one of these great buzzwords, right? You Google it and it kind of, everybody's in favor of it. Who can be against it? You know, it doesn't really, unless you define it, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's a great political word because, you know, who can be against resilience? But, you know, when you start looking at it, different people have different meanings. But, you know, there's the engineering resilience, you know, building the walls higher. There's architectural resilience. But there's also economic resilience. You know, a richer company or a richer city is going to be a bit more resilient. There's also social resilience. There's cultural resilience. There's financial resilience, separate from economics. Financial resilience is having this sort of insurance in place there, and I think that's all a big part of it. And you know, the reason that resilience becomes a national security issue is not because that first event is the problem. You know, the hurricane that comes. Hurricanes are going to happen, as David said. They're happening every year, and you know, I think there's good scientific evidence that perhaps they're not happening more often, but certainly they're more dangerous and expected to become more dangerous around the world. Other extreme weather events, other you know, all sorts of you know, events that are outside of ours. But the important thing about resilience is that it gets to that second, third, fourth order effects. And these are where we have to have a bit of imagination and a bit of thinking about what they are, and that's why actually exercises like this city risk index are important, because it's a way to put that imagination on paper, put it out there, and kind of test it in the court of public opinion. People can then come back and say, oh well, no, that's wrong, or that's wrong, or that, even more importantly, that is interconnected with this. Dante mentioned the power outage in 2003. Who would have thought that a tree outside of Cleveland could have knocked out the Northeast power grid? Now, that means it's not a resilient infrastructure, but I would argue though that kind of proved that it was a resilient culture, resilient socially. I was in 2003. I was up in New Jersey at the time, and had lots of friends living in New York. In the 70s in New York, when there was the famous power outages, there was looting and riots and everything going on. 2003 power outage, people were scared for a little bit. It was shortly after 9/11, but mostly you heard stories of people getting together, lighting some candles, getting through it. Social resilience. It's about making sure that first thing that happens doesn't cascade into the second, third, fourth order effects. It's these unpredictable sort of next level things that happen that can become the problem after that. Hurricane Katrina happened, but the levees were supposed to be able to hold against a Category 3 hurricane, as it was at the time, and it was a failure then. Now they've built back and spent a lot of money in that. The problem with resiliency is you don't really know until it's tested, until that first thing happens. So you try and build in all of these other resilient systems, resilient engineering, resilient architecture, resilient everything, but you don't really know, because you need that sort of imagination. And it kind of goes to the national security space into intelligence, that the biggest intelligence failures in the United States history have been about these failures of imagination. Pearl Harbor, 1941, plenty of people were expecting a Japanese attack on American facilities in the Philippines and on British colonies in Hong Kong and elsewhere. But no one was expecting them at Pearl Harbor. Or maybe people were, and it just didn't get to the right people. 9/11, you look at the 9/11 report, and there were plenty of people who were talking about these sorts of things, but they failed in that intelligence. And again, Hurricane Katrina. And so it's kind of resilience. It doesn't stop that first action, but it stops those other actions from becoming a national security problem, crisis. And there's one more that I want to kind of mention on this that's kind of not one you think of very often. It's Mount Pinatubo, volcano in the Philippines. It erupted in 1991. And maybe 91, I think. It was a volcano that had been dormant for a long time. Nobody was expecting it. And it started to bubble up, I guess, and smoke some. And they said, oh, this is gonna go. And the indigenous people who had been living in that area for hundreds, thousands of years had it within their culture, and they moved. A lot of the other people didn't believe the seismologists when they said, oh, this is going to go up, and a number of them died. But, so that's kind of your cultural resilience. But the second, third order effects here, it went off, and it covered, surrounding that was Clark Airfield and Subic Bay bases, U.S. naval bases, U.S. air bases, that American forces had been stationed at since the Spanish-American War back in 1898. So So after that, Subic Bay is covered in mud, and this is the end of the Cold War. So we decided we don't need this anymore. It's going to cost us a lot of money to pull that, to make this all usable again. We don't really need this in this time anymore, so we're just going to leave it and abandon it, and U.S. Pacific forces will go up to Guam and Okinawa. But the second...
Andrew, I'm just going to very quickly interject because I'm mindful of time.
Okay. So,
and I want to also get this eager audience.
Let me finish this story. So the second, third order effect is that there's no U.S. naval presence in South China Sea. The Chinese push into this this vacuum, and we see today in the news that they've installed missiles on islands in the South China Sea, and I think you could argue that if the U.S. Navy had been there for the last 25 years, that wouldn't have happened. So these sorts of unpredictable failures of imagination. So just kind of interesting things that we don't always think about. So
great.
Off to that.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So we'll take questions by show of hands, and we have one right here. There's a roving microphone. Great.
This is an absolutely fabulous event. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I created the Energy Conversation 10 years ago, funded by the Department of Defense, and it was the Navy, in fact, that was the leader. My observation in the last 10 years is that the American public doesn't understand any of this. So my question is, who's going to tell the stories? Your stories have been fabulous. All I wanted to do was to see them visually. And the question is, who's going to take the responsibility of creating visual stories for the American voter so they understand how things work, why they work the way they do, and potential things we could do about it. I should just tell you, I raised this question last week with Larry Summers. We were talking about economics, and his answer was, well, that's not my job. So my question is, whose job is it to educate the public so we don't end up in this absolutely absurd political system that we're now operating in?
The right mic lit up on this panel. Mr. Wells.
So I was in Paris for COP21, and I was there with the convening of over 1,000 local municipalities. As Meghan said, that 50% of the world's population live in cities, and in 20 years, 70% of the world's population will live in cities. And so at the gathering of the cities in Paris, the best example was that you had Mitch Landrieu from New Orleans. Now, he had to be there. His city is directly impacted by global climate change and rising water, obviously. So Mitch Landrieu was engaged and engaging his constituents in that conversation. Who's not there would have been the Governor Jindal. Governor Jindal has not really even admitted climate change, let alone caused by mankind, with a solution to mankind. So I do believe that the cities, the population centers who have to deal with this, New York City, San Francisco, the other, especially the cities along the coastal areas, that I think that is where the leadership is in the world right now in terms of implementing resiliency. You have to do it in New Orleans. If you don't do it, you're in trouble.
Well, and what's refreshing about this conversation is that these things don't get people elected in 4-year electoral cycles, which is why Lloyd's putting their money where their mouth is and putting such forward-thinking research out there allows the market and the private sector to fill the void where the politicians may not be, with one exception. So we'll take more questions from the audience by show of hands, right over here.
Graham Jenkins, I'm with EY. There's sort of an inherent tension between resilience and efficiency that can be difficult to overcome. You see it hard to justify things like buying enough snow plows for a 2-foot storm when on average you get 5 inches here and there. So it's almost more difficult to overcome too in the private sector when profit margins are the focus and sort of that relentless efficiency, just-in-time supply chains, that kind of thing. So how do you balance those two? How do you ensure some degree of resilience while sacrificing efficiency?
With insurance. Yeah, insurance. How do you ensure, because this goes back to Mitzi's question too, nobody wants to pay more taxes and nobody really wants to pay more insurance premiums, I can admit that. But the thing is, as we build out the infrastructure, which will take time and will take a lot of public policy debates, you can rent a little piece of a snowplow in the event that you need 10 snowplows by paying a little premium every year, and it won't hurt your profit margin as much if you're in the private sector. So I would just again make the argument here for insurance. Just to go back to what you said, telling the story of this in a way that would have made my single mom with 2 kids want to pay more taxes to the folks back in Washington back in 1985, that's a tough one. You're going to have a hard time doing that. And we do need, the likes of Lloyd's of London, we need the private sector, the insurance sector, and we need government coming together to say, look, there's earthquake risk in Salt Lake City that is terribly underinsured. If something happens here, nobody's going to pay for it. And, so we've got to be able to make that case. And you said visually, I think that we should just get this out there everywhere we can and let people know.
Also, another answer to that it's a great question. As the lead negotiator for the Exelon-Pepco merger, that I have to go to a public that's very skeptical about a large corporation managing our power distribution in the grid. But you go back to Hurricane Isabel, that we had to wait when the power went out for trucks to come up from Arkansas to help rebuild our grid. And with a larger company, with a deeper bench, Constellation being part of Exelon in Baltimore and elsewhere, because people don't want to pay, you're right, for the extra trucks. They don't want to pay for having people on standby just in case there's a weather event. So the efficiencies have to be reimagined, because you're right, it is seems inefficient to have folks sitting around for months at a time.
Let me just offer a quick interjection. I guess this is the moderator's privilege. One person tries to blow up an aircraft with their shoes, everybody takes their shoes off. We comply because the threat feels immediate. In my world, Sandy and Irene and Katrina and all of these types of things are the meteorological equivalent of these types of events. And now these urban populations are going to demand solutions for this, because this is now affecting, it's not a foregone conclusion in the Horn of Africa any longer. It's now something we're feeling very much here at home. And I think that will drive the type of awareness that you're asking for of our communities and our people. We have a question in the back. Emilio?
I'm Amelia Boom with Development Finance International. I'm building on the earlier question, then how do you deal with the moral hazard issue, right? Because I see the index risks, a quarter of the challenge is market crash, and yet we're still all paying not just for the banks, the big banks to fail, but also for AIG's rescue. So I'd like to pose that to the panel. Thank you.
All right, just because I'm the insurance guy up here, good point. It was the financial products division of AIG in London that got in trouble. The underwriting entities were perfectly solvent and actually performing good service and underwriting during that time. I see your point though about moral hazard, and this is just the kind of the tragedy of the commons situation, where everybody wants to have protection from risk, but nobody really wants to pay for it. And we see this in Florida. We see this in areas of seismic activity. I don't want to have to say this, but I think that sometimes the experience drives action. And so as we have more of these events, I think risk premia will increase and people will realize that it's something that they have to pay for. If you look at Florida, one of the short-term, what happened after Katrina and Rita and Wilma in Florida was that reinsurance rates on line went up pretty drastically by about 30% during that time. And not just because of that, but because of a whole bunch of other dynamics that were going on in the sector, including what was for us the liability crisis, which involved asbestosis and environmental problems. But That reaction wasn't acceptable to the citizens of Florida. So Florida Citizens Insurance received more funding and was established. The Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund was set up to buy reinsurance at a non-market price, really, for Florida citizens to sort of mitigate price increases. That was, I think in the long term, that will prove to be more expensive for Floridians, just because it's an uneconomic price that they're going to pay. Right now, it's reinsurance is a lot cheaper in Florida, and they could arguably be saving money. But to avoid that kind of thing, I think we have to think about what happens ahead of time, and that's a pretty good illustrative example of how people can get hit when they build that close to the coast. I think people should just be aware of it. It is, though, a moral hazard, and again, people think they have a fundamental right to build 20 feet away from the beach and not pay for hurricane insurance. It's just going to have to be a long-term change in how people perceive risk, and it'll happen by events. It'll be events, dear boy, events that drive the change in perception.
And if I may add to that, I'm actually glad, it's a great question, Emilio. For the uninitiated in the audience, the moral hazard is risk-taking without bearing the consequences or the downside of the risk. But I would actually advocate that the moral hazard exists in federally and state and government-backed programs. So flood insurance programs, if you started doing some of the math that David could do on the back of a napkin, it wouldn't take long to identify the fact that there's going to be a huge gap in these plans. State insurance guarantees wouldn't withstand the types of shocks we're talking about in today's event. And so the real moral hazard is government-backed programs that suppress the price of these policies for flood insurance, windstorm, et cetera, are mispricing risks. And effectively, you're incenting people after a tornado to rebuild a house with bricks and sticks again. And you're preventing real adaptation to take place that would build more resilience. So building houses out of concrete, domed structures, et cetera, to withstand these storms. So if after every calamity you could rebuild exactly the thing you lost, why change? And so I would advocate that the moral hazard exists mostly on the government side.
I don't want to keep blathering on here, and I want to let Meghan talk, but there are a couple of other models out there internationally, some of which I'm not crazy about. Like in France, they have mandatory insurance purchase for people just have to buy insurance. The gouvernement just dictates that that's what you have to do. I don't think that's going to work here. I think maybe regulations on building codes and things might be more acceptable, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
A question in the front row, unless Meghan, you want anything to add?
Just to add to the conversations around the past couple of questions too, I think another thing to keep in mind here in terms of changing perceptions and thinking of how to prioritize these sort of actions that have large risks is also keeping in mind co-benefits. I mean, there's a lot of adaptation actions in particular that are going to benefit public health, going to help the economy, and we talk about that a lot in terms of mitigation, I mean, around green jobs and things like that. But to try to bring that sort of conversation to this as well, I think can help, especially with public opinion, can help change some perceptions as well.
Thank you, Meghan.
Can you hear me? Yeah, there we go. My name is Serene Marshall. I work for a place called the Urban Land Institute. We're a membership organization of people in the real estate business who develop and invest in real estate. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. Building codes are one thing that obviously speaks to our membership, but capital also speaks to our membership. And so I'm wondering ways in which the Lloyd's Index or the NDGain Index might actually do something to affect the price of capital for real estate or where capital can be gotten, so that we don't build things like underground parking in Miami, which we're doing right now.
Well, the cost, thinking about it in, I'm sorry to do this, but thinking about it in corporate finance terms, if you are a real estate firm, and it's particularly a commercial real estate firm, and I'm just going to keep banging on about this, the cost of debt in our economy in terms of refinancing costs, the cost of equity in terms of look at what just happened to the stock market costs, versus the cost of insurance risk transfer. The cost of insurance risk transfer is falling. The cost of those other forms of contingent capital is rising. So if you're a real estate company and you're trying to maximize your enterprise value and lower your weighted average cost of capital, if you're the CFO of a real estate firm, you should be considering additional risk transfer to mitigate your cost of capital, even if that means ensuring underwater parking in Miami.
And that's how you create a moral hazard.
Exactly. That's right. I can help you create that moral hazard.
And just to briefly add to that too, even though we don't really, look at decisions like that and use our framework to say yes or no on things outside of specifically adaptation actions, I do think that sort of decision making comes from a lack of looking at a city holistically and looking at, as David was speaking to earlier, future exposure data, right? Looking at these future hazards and trying to understand what that means for your human population now. And so if you're thinking of just to solve one problem, then your cost and benefits are going to look a little bit different. So I think also adding to another point of David's, the lack of data that's out there and the need for us to galvanize around not only more data but better data to allow decision makers to make a more holistic decision making so that their scales are tipped in the right direction.
Can the Lloyd City Risk Index be used as a policy tool? Like next time I turn on C-SPAN and I hear people banging on about climate change, which I've heard a million times, can they put, as you were saying, Mitzi, the pictures behind it by using the index, saying this is what will happen in your city if this happens? I mean, I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, I think we're starting that right now,
okay.
And hopefully the remaining panels also bring that home. But that's a very good point. Question from the gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Nick Verhart. I'm with Louis Berger. We have an office in New York and here in D.C. I just want to loop back to one of the questions about efficiency and resiliency. And I also want to loop back to what you said about additional benefits and the problem with data visualization and things like that. I think there's an opportunity here to make the data one of the central aspects in making this happen. And one of the ways to do that is to do the commercial data acquisition and the Internet of Things and all those other things that are happening really in high gear right now, and basically have the resiliency data ride on that commercial data train that is being driven by market drivers. So what that means is that as you are collecting data about how systems work, how natural systems work, how man-made systems work, how transit systems work, you are also collecting immediate feedback data on resiliency issues. And the benefits of that data are not going to transpire over a long period of time when a disaster occurs, but they're actually immediately palpable and can be visualized. And there are some initiatives on the way right now with the smart city concept and other concepts that I think can help with the visualization and make the link between resiliency, efficiency, and sustainability.
Thank you. Tommy.
Just a quick add-on is that, as Judge Hill noted, that we have to, and we assume in this room, a changed paradigm, but a lot of our models do not, that we still operate from, whether it be the 500-year flood or the 100-year flood. Everything looks back on historical data to create probability. To have models that does not use historical data, but predictive data based on a changing future is a new challenge for us. And that's, so data, you're right, should drive our decision making, but we have to change the paradigm of how we produce, accept, and interpret the data.
And, just again on the Internet of Things, we have to also recall that embracing too quickly and too prematurely the next big thing also creates the next big risk. Ask OnStar how they feel about their cars being commandeered by remote devices and people taking over aircraft through iPads for sport. So there is some downside risk to becoming too model dependent, and there's such a thing as model error and things like that. Question right here from the gentleman.
William Pitt, Beasley. I was interested in a couple of things that Judge Hill said, and they seem to me to be connected. One of the things she said, and I'd be interested in the panel's perspective on this, is when bad things happen, we all want the federal government to offer assistance. And then she expressed surprise, perhaps, that the rates of insurance penetration in New Zealand were so much higher than California. And I'm not sure that those aren't actually connected, that the incentives to buy earthquake insurance in California are much lower than the incentives to buy it in New Zealand. So I'm just interested in the panel's perspectives on whether the incentives to buy insurance, commercial insurance in the US, are fundamentally skewed in favor of waiting for the federal government to come in and help.
Part of that, I think, and I'm just trying to remember, you may know this better than me if you're an underwriter, but in New Zealand, the New Zealand Earthquake Authority has a mandate to buy reinsurance, which I think is taxpayer subsidized in New Zealand. So that's part of it, and then that creates a natural amount of insurance penetration for New Zealand that doesn't exist in California in the same way. But you're right, that Americans generally we're not collectivists in the same way that a lot of other countries are. We're not natural collectivists, and people dislike being forced to pay for stuff or even paying for anything if they think that the government will come in afterwards and take care of it. It is a moral hazard, but you're probably right. It is related. It's a conundrum that we have to solve.
And that's the challenge across the coastal areas across the country, including D.C., that we're redrawing the floodplains right now of where floods are likely to occur. And as soon as you're in that area, there's a general presumption that you're going to need some type of flood insurance. In general, in America, we need, at least homeowners and folks need federal flood insurance support in order to be able to afford flood insurance. And so does the federal government want to continue that if these buildings are built without the hardening that they need in order to preserve and protect from damage from floods, do they want to continue to do this? And certainly in new areas that have been purchased along coastal areas on speculative prices, that they didn't speculate the additional cost of flood insurance. And they don't want to be included in that flood likely plain, so because of that whole flood insurance question. But that is that's a debate and conundrum that's going across. And does FEMA have the political will to say you're not going to be qualified as an audit now to show that you did not pull the permits and get approved for what you built here in terms of flood protection? Do they have the stomach to do that? I don't know.
I think that might be a good place to start, actually, because if it's true that that FEMA has, if they have the ability and the political will to do that, I don't know that either, but it would give, it could change the rules of the game rather quickly, at least with regard to flood insurance, especially if it was real estate firms that you're talking to rather than voters. That might help.
Well, I would say FEMA might, but my experience working in Congress tells you that they're bosses who control the money, and you say that Americans aren't collectivists. Most of the time,
From
we're
Utah.
not. We're not collectivists until there's a crisis, until we're being hit, or we feel for our compatriots who are being hit. And how many politicians ran after Sandy to the coast and said, we will rebuild? Well, maybe Breezy Point shouldn't be rebuilt in New York Harbor. Maybe you shouldn't rebuild your home on Point Pleasant on the Jersey Shore, right on top of the dune. Build the dune higher. And so, but we did this study at ASP that found it was 15 times more effective for the government to pay. This isn't even insurance, private sector, 15 times more effective to pay before the crisis than the amount after. But the amount spent was more like 100 times after.
Yeah, and I think that may have to be the last word, because there's a very important pause that happens right now that allows you to engage with one another. But I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you for your participation. Thank you.